Back when I was in high school, my dad and I lived in a small, two-bedroom apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood. My dad worked the night shift as a security guard, so most evenings I was home alone from 9 p.m. to about 5 a.m. By the time I was a senior, I was used to it. This particular night happened in early spring, just a couple of months before graduation. It was a Thursday evening, and everything started off like any other night. Around 8:30 p.m., I said goodbye to my dad as he headed out for work. After locking the door behind him, I grabbed a snack, turned on the TV, and spent the next few hours playing a new video game I had just gotten. Even though it was a school night, I wasn't in any rush to go to bed. At around midnight, I decided to call it a night and shut everything off. I went to my room, brushed my teeth, and climbed into bed. Like most nights, I ended up scrolling through social media on my phone for another half hour before finally falling asleep. I woke up sometime later to the sound of a door closing. My first thought was that my dad must have gotten home early, which wasn't entirely unusual. I glanced at the digital clock on my nightstand and saw that it was just after 4 a.m. Relieved that it was almost time to wake up for the day anyway, I rolled over and closed my eyes again. But then I heard footsteps, slow and steady, coming from the living room. Usually, my dad would grab something to eat from the kitchen and head straight to his room, but whoever was walking around didn't seem to be following that routine. As I lay there listening, the footsteps continued, moving methodically from room to room, almost as if someone was inspecting the place. A sense of unease started creeping over me. Something didn't feel right. I reached over and turned on the lamp next to my bed, hoping the light would help me feel more at ease. But as soon as the room lit up, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt suffocating. I sat there for a moment, straining to hear any movement. Then, cautiously, I got up and walked to my bedroom door. I opened it just a crack and peered down the hallway. The apartment was completely dark. No lights had been turned on in any of the rooms. My heart was pounding as I slowly made my way down the hall to the top of the stairs that led to the living room. Kneeling down, I peeked through the railing, but I didn't see anything out of place. The TV was off, and my dad's laptop was still sitting on the coffee table where he'd left it. For a brief moment, I convinced myself that I had imagined it all. Maybe I'd misheard something in my half-asleep state. Just to be sure, I called out softly, "Dad, is that you?" No response. I waited, listening intently, but the apartment remained silent. My pulse quickened as I made my way down the stairs. When I reached the bottom, I walked into the kitchen, hoping to find some logical explanation for what I'd heard. That's when I saw it, a faint, muddy shoe print on the tile floor near the back door. My stomach dropped. Slowly, I raised my head, and that's when I saw him. Sitting at the small dining table was a man. He wore a black hoodie pulled low over his face, and his jeans were dirty and torn. He had a scarf covering his lower face, but I could see his piercing eyes staring directly at me. He didn't move or say anything. He just sat there, eerily calm, as if he belonged there. For a moment, I froze, unsure of what to do. Then, adrenaline took over, and I bolted back upstairs, slamming my bedroom door shut and locking it behind me. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and called 911. The operator tried to keep me calm while I explained what was happening. As I spoke, I heard the faint creak of footsteps on the stairs. The man was coming up. My heart felt like it might explode as I whispered to the operator, praying that help would arrive in time. Then, just as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs, I heard the faint sound of the front door opening. For a moment, everything went quiet. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of footsteps retreating, this time heading out the front door. Not long after, flashing blue and red lights lit up my window. I ran outside as my dad pulled into the driveway, arriving at the same time as the police. I told them everything, but by the time they searched the apartment and surrounding area, the man was long gone. To this day, I still don't know who he was or what he wanted. What haunts me the most is the timing. If my dad had come home even a few minutes later, who knows what could have happened. I live alone in a small, isolated house on the edge of the woods. My nearest neighbors are a half-mile down the road, but I don't often see them. I mostly keep to myself, taking occasional trips into town for supplies, but that's rare, especially now that I'm mostly retired. In the fall, I still do some contracting work, but this particular day I was just finishing up my yearly preparations for winter. It was one of those crisp, late fall afternoons, the kind where you can almost taste the chill in the air. I was outside, moving my tools, lawnmowers, and other equipment into the shed for the season. The place had always been peaceful, too quiet, some might say, but I liked it that way. As I was rounding the corner of the shed, something caught my eye. There was a man walking down the narrow dirt road that ran alongside my property. It wasn't the usual sight. Nobody walked down this road unless they were lost or had a reason to be here. The town was far away, a good 4 hours walk at least, and the road was rarely used by anyone but the few locals. The man didn't have anything with him, no backpack or camping gear. Nothing at all, which seemed strange considering the distance. I stood there watching him until he disappeared in the distance. I scanned the road in both directions, but there wasn't a car in sight. It was an odd sight, but after a few minutes, I let it go. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I finished gathering my things, went inside, and locked the door behind me as darkness began to settle in. I was sitting at the kitchen table, eating a simple dinner, when I heard a loud thud from outside. It sounded like wood hitting wood. My heart skipped a beat as I quickly stood up and rushed to the window. The shed door, always stubborn and difficult to open, was now wide open. That wasn't right. I grabbed my rifle from the hallway closet, figuring I could at least check things out without being unprepared. I wasn't expecting trouble, but something felt wrong. The yard was silent as I stepped outside, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. I walked toward the shed, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the night. Nothing seemed out of place, but I still searched the shed carefully, my boots crunching in the dry grass. The place was empty, no animals, no signs of anything unusual. I secured the shed door and started heading back to the house, but as I crossed the field, a strange feeling began creeping up my spine. I couldn't shake it, like something was watching me. When I reached the front door, I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, and froze. A large, muddy shoe print was clearly visible on the floor just inside the entryway. I flicked on the hallway light. More footprints, muddy and uneven, stretched across the hallway, leading toward the guest bedroom. My pulse quickened as I silently raised the rifle, knowing something was terribly wrong. I moved carefully toward the bedroom door, pressing my ear against the wood. I could hear something. Breathing, slow, deliberate, and deep, right on the other side. Before I could react, the door handle turned, and the door swung open violently. A man stood there in the doorway, his face twisted in rage, holding a large metal shovel raised high. My gun was up in an instant. He froze. His eyes were wide with anger, and I could see his muscles tense, ready to charge. I shouted at him to stay back, my voice rough with fear, but somehow it came out strong. He didn't move forward, but his stare never faltered. We stood there for a long moment in silence, neither of us daring to make a move. My mind raced. I could call the police, but by the time they arrived, he could be long gone, or worse. I didn't want to risk holding him at gunpoint for too long. The tension in the air was suffocating. Without warning, the man hurled the shovel at me, then turned and bolted back into the room. I quickly followed, instinct pulling me toward him. He was scrambling toward the window, crawling through it with surprising speed. I almost reached out to stop him, but something in me hesitated. He was already gone, sprinting off into the vast, dark field, disappearing into the night. I never saw him again, never found out who he was or what he wanted. To this day, he remains a mystery. All I can say is this: if I hadn't had that rifle in my hands, or if he had managed to surprise me, I'm not sure I'd be here to tell the story. It was a Friday night in 2018, and I was at home, trying to finish a work project. I had promised myself that if I could just wrap it up, I'd get to enjoy the weekend without any stress hanging over me. By then, it was close to 10 p.m., and I'd already been sitting at my desk for about 3 hours. After a full day of work earlier, my energy was running on fumes. My focus was slipping, and I found myself rereading the same sentence over and over. Frustrated, I decided to take a short break. I stood up, stretched my stiff muscles, and paced around my small office. The cool air from the window gave me a momentary jolt of energy, but as I walked past it, something outside caught my eye. I thought I saw a flicker of movement in the dark. I froze, leaning closer to the window for a better look. My office was on the second floor, overlooking the front yard, driveway, and porch. At first, everything seemed still, and I started to feel silly for being so jumpy. Maybe it was just a shadow from a tree or a trick of the light. But then I saw it again, a faint shape shifting near the sidewalk that led to the porch. It looked like someone was standing there, partially hidden in the shadows. My stomach tightened. I stayed by the window, squinting to make out details, but the figure barely moved. All I could see was a vague silhouette that blended into the darkness. My heart started to race as I realized someone might actually be at my door. Unable to shake the uneasy feeling, I decided to head downstairs to get a closer look. I walked quietly, my steps feeling unnaturally loud in the stillness of the house. When I reached the front door, I pressed my eye to the peephole. There was a man standing there. He looked to be in his late 30s, with stringy, shoulder-length dark hair and a thin, almost gaunt frame. His clothes, a wrinkled hoodie and faded jeans, were worn and unkempt. His skin was pale, giving him an almost ghostly appearance. What unnerved me most, though, was his expression. He didn't look angry or sad, just blank, as if he were lost in thought or somewhere far away. He didn't knock or ring the doorbell. He didn't even fidget or shift his weight. He just stood there, facing the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob, uncertain of what to do. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, his head tilted slightly, as if he'd heard me but wasn't sure how to respond. His gaze shifted past the door, almost like he was trying to look through it and into my home. A chill ran down my spine. I cleared my throat and raised my voice. "If you don't have a reason to be here, I need you to leave." The man didn't respond. He stood there for a moment longer before I heard faint footsteps as he walked down the porch steps and into the night. I exhaled, realizing I had been holding my breath. I peeked out the window to confirm he was really gone before heading back upstairs. I told myself he was probably just lost or confused, and there was no reason to overthink it. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as I sat back down at my desk. Just as I started working again, a sudden, thunderous knocking rattled the front door. This wasn't the hesitant knock of someone unsure if they were welcome. This was loud and insistent, almost aggressive. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding, and raced downstairs. I didn't bother looking through the peephole this time. I threw the door open, ready to confront whoever was there. It was him again. But something about him was different now. His body language had shifted. His posture was rigid, and his hands were buried deep in the pocket of his hoodie. His face was no longer blank, it was tense, and his eyes were locked onto mine in a way that sent a jolt of fear through me. My eyes darted to his pocket, and that's when I saw it. He was gripping something, a metallic object partially hidden in the folds of fabric. The top of it looked like the handle of a knife. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound firm. He didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, and without thinking, I slammed the door shut. The doorknob rattled violently as he tried to force his way in. Fumbled with the deadbolt, my hands shaking, but I managed to lock it just as he pushed against the door. He banged on the door, his fists thudding against the wood, and for a moment I thought it might give way. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the banging stopped. I listened, holding my breath, and eventually heard his footsteps retreating into the night. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, too scared to move. Finally, I grabbed my phone and called 911. The police arrived about 20 minutes later and searched the area, but the man was gone. They assured me they would keep an eye out, but I knew the chances of finding him were slim. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. I had a long day at work. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. The kind of tired where your body feels heavy and all you want to do is sit down and shut everything out. I'd been running around all day, handling emails, meetings, and errands. I could barely keep my eyes open as I dropped my bag on the floor and kicked off my shoes. It was already late, so I didn't bother making dinner. I just wanted some peace and quiet. I settled onto the couch and turned on the TV, letting the soft light from the screen fill the room. The house was empty, silent, except for the occasional hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. For a few moments I relaxed, letting my muscles unwind after a long day. But then the doorbell rang. It wasn't loud, but it was clear. The sound of it sliced through the quiet like a sudden shock. I stared at the door, confused. It was past midnight. Who would be at my door at this hour? I rubbed my face, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. Maybe it was a neighbor, someone needing help or asking for something. I wasn't sure, but I couldn't ignore it. I pushed myself off the couch and walked to the door, my feet dragging on the floor. I checked through the peephole first. The porch was empty. No one was there. I frowned, a little confused. Maybe someone had rung the bell and left, or maybe I had imagined it. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't like anyone lived nearby who would show up at this time. But then, just as I turned to head back to the couch, the doorbell rang again. This time, it was louder. It was like someone was standing right there, pressing the button over and over. My stomach tightened. I stared at the door, unsure of what to do next. I opened it a crack, just enough to peek outside. The porch was still empty. No one. I stepped outside onto the porch, looked around quickly, and saw nothing. The street was dark, the only light coming from the dim street lamps scattered down the road. There were no cars, no movement, just the night air, crisp and cold against my skin. I stepped back inside and locked the door behind me, brushing the whole thing off. It was probably nothing. Maybe some kids running around, maybe even someone with the wrong house. Still, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't right. My heart was still racing, my body tense. I walked away from the door, but just as I turned the corner of the hallway, I heard it again, the doorbell. This time it was persistent, ringing over and over. I jumped at the sound, my muscles stiffening. I went back to the door, but when I looked through the peephole this time, there was still no one there. My hands felt clammy, and I had this strange urge to just leave the door locked and not think about it. But I couldn't. It was like a feeling was crawling under my skin, telling me that something was wrong. I opened the door all the way this time, stepping outside again to get a better look. There was still no one in sight. The wind had picked up a little, and I could hear the sound of leaves rustling in the trees. The street was as empty as before. I took a deep breath and turned to head back inside, but then I heard something. Soft footsteps, almost inaudible, as if someone was walking quietly on the porch. I froze, my blood going cold. I didn't dare turn around. The footsteps stopped, and I heard a faint scraping sound, like someone was dragging something across the wood of the porch. I slowly backed away, my eyes scanning the shadows. I couldn't see anyone, but the air felt heavy, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My hands were shaking. I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but as I spoke to the operator, the scraping sound stopped. I tried to calm myself, thinking maybe I had imagined it. But then, as I waited for a response from the police, I heard it again, the scraping sound, closer this time. I rushed back into the house, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it quickly, then shoved a chair under the doorknob for extra security. My phone was still pressed to my ear, but all I could hear was the operator asking what the emergency was. I didn't know what to say. I was too scared to even speak. I waited, listening to the silence, but my mind raced. Was it someone messing with me, or was it something worse? My thoughts spun in every direction. Then came the knock. A single, sharp knock on the door. It startled me so much I nearly dropped the phone. I rushed to the door, my mind screaming at me to not open it. I peered through the peephole again, but all I saw was darkness. The knock came again. This time, there were 3 loud raps. I stayed where I was, paralyzed, watching the door. I wanted to call the police, but I didn't want to risk making any noise that could give away my position. Then came the sound of fingernails lightly dragging across the door, slow and deliberate, like someone was testing how solid the wood was. I couldn't take it anymore. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel the presence out there, something waiting. For the next few minutes, there was no sound at all, absolute silence. But that silence felt like it was waiting for something to happen. I watched through the peephole again, but the porch was still empty. The doorbell never rang again that night.